Hey there. Tonight, we journey back to a time before cities, before kings, before memory itself. A time when the first humans wandered the open savanna, watching the sky and waiting for something as simple and as vital as rain. This is not a story of names or battles. It's a quiet story, a slow one, a story of heat, dust, and the silence between thunderclaps, of cracked earth and shared water, of ancient eyes turned skyward, hoping the clouds would finally break. So now, dim the lights, let your body rest, and ease into the story of how the first humans waited for rain. The ground was cracked, not just in lines, but in wide-open mouths that looked as if the earth itself was thirsty enough to swallow anything that moved. Dust coated everything: the rocks, the bones, the sleeping places. It hung in the air without a breeze to scatter it, settling on skin, sticking in nostrils, collecting in the corners of the eyes like dried tears. The sun didn't rise. It pressed down, heavy and constant, a white disk in a faded sky that had long ago stopped shifting. There were no clouds to shield or promise, only a wide, empty dome overhead, too pale to be called blue, too cruel to be called heaven. Even the birds had grown quiet. They no longer circled in search of insects that had fled or died. The air was too still for wings, too dry for calls. Only silence hovered above the brittle savanna, waiting. At night, the heat didn't leave. It simply sank into the ground, curling into the rock and roots. When darkness came, it came without coolness, as if the stars were tiny wounds in the sky, too far away to soothe. There were no breezes to bring rest. Sleep, if it came, was shallow and sticky, clinging to the skin like sweat that wouldn't dry. Some dreamed of rain, but most didn't. Dreams had become too heavy, too expensive for bodies working to survive. They slept on their sides to protect their bellies, arms curled in, as if sheltering something inside that might still be soft. But nothing was soft anymore. Even the grass, once yellow-green and flowing like hair, now lay stiff and brown, snapping underfoot, whispering like ash. In the distance, trees stood like bones, gnarled and exhausted. Their shadows barely moved throughout the day, so straight and thin they looked painted on the dust. Leaves were scarce, curled inwards, brittle to the touch. The animals had begun to vanish, not all at once, but in steady silence. The large ones moved first, hoofbeats fading over the cracked riverbeds, and then the smaller ones followed, or fell. Carcasses were rare not because there was no death, but because nothing was left uneaten. Vultures came first, then the insects, then the sun. Nothing wasted, nothing spared. Even footprints dried into permanence, etched into the clay like the last lines of a forgotten language. The savanna recorded every step now, but offered nothing back. The people did not speak much. Words dried in the throat, curled up and died before they could pass between lips. They looked to the sky not with hope, but with habit. Looking had once been prayer, but now it was memory, a ritual done because it used to mean something. Some still marked the days by the position of the sun or the lean of shadows. Others had stopped counting. Their bodies bore the story more clearly than any markings could. Ribs pushing at skin, shoulders curved inwards, eyes squinting even in the dim morning light. Skin that had once glistened now flaked, as if the body itself was turning to dust, trying to blend in. The sky unchanged, offered no sign that it remembered how to cry. It simply hovered there, high, pale, and mute, as if watching the world below struggle with the silence it had given. The dust wasn't just something seen anymore. It was something lived inside of. It clung to eyelashes, settled into the folds behind knees, lined the inside of the nose with a fine, gritty coating that no breath could avoid. Every inhalation brought more of it in. It scratched the back of the throat like dried grass stems, collecting in the soft places and grinding slowly against the tender walls of the mouth. The people had stopped coughing. Coughing only wasted water. Now they swallowed it, ignored it, lived with it. Dust in the nostrils, dust in the windpipe, dust between their back teeth. Even when they chewed nothing, their jaws moved against sand. It made food taste like earth, and made silence feel heavier. There was no escape from it. The air had become a slow-moving fog of grit, lifted and dropped by steps, by windless shifts in temperature, by the weight of waiting. Eyes were the worst, not just from the sting, but from the blurring. The world was already faded under the sun, but with dust, it lost shape entirely. Trees became outlines. Figures melted into the background of hills. People squinted constantly, not in suspicion, but survival, trying to find clean angles in a world that had gone soft at the edges. Blinking only made it worse. Grains gathered in the corners, rubbed themselves into eyelids, scratched with every motion. Some tried to wash their faces with dry hands, but it only made the dirt settle deeper into skin. Even tears were useless. They dried before they reached the cheeks, and crying was reserved for something more than irritation. Crying belonged to grief. This was just endurance. The sun baked the grit into the sweat on their faces, forming masks of salt and soil that cracked when they spoke, which wasn't often. When they ate, the dust came too. No matter how carefully they cleaned what little they found, roots, berries, sometimes a lizard, it still tasted of the land. Between the fibers of meat, there would always be a crunch, unexpected but constant. Chewing became a negotiation, a slow, deliberate act of separating the edible from the inescapable. Tongues moved cautiously, wary of grinding too hard, lest a tooth give way or a shard slice the gum. Even the youngest had learned to chew this way. Infants suckled dust with milk. Children picked it from their teeth like old men. No one remembered when food had tasted clean. The memory itself seemed foreign, a luxury from a time too far to reach back toward. Now the flavor of the Savannah was in every bite, bitter, dry, ancient. And the worst of it was that no one spoke of it. Dust was no longer worth mention. It was too common, too intimate, too shared. Complaining would only echo what everyone already knew. So they endured it in silence. They breathed it in, swallowed it, slept with it in their mouths. Sometimes they dreamed of water, not of drinking it, but of rinsing, of spitting, of feeling a single clean drop wash across the tongue. But waking always came fast and dry, lips cracked, teeth still stained with silt. They stood each day with throats raw, mouths packed with the earth they were trying not to become. And still they moved forward, not toward anything, but away from stillness. Because in stillness, the dust only settled deeper. The river no longer flowed. It lay in stretches now, isolated, shrunken pools that shimmered not with life but with stillness. The water had turned brown long ago, then green, then gray. Around the edges of what remained, Thick mud clung to footprints like warning signs. Each day, the distance to the next pool grew longer, and each time they returned, something else was gone. Fish had fled first, then the birds, then the larger prey, moving far beyond the valley where water had once run like a thread tying all things together. Now that thread was broken, and with it, the patterns of the hunt began to unravel. No one said it out loud, but everyone knew. The animals were leaving, dying, or becoming too dangerous to chase. There were tracks in the dust, but fewer of them. And the ones they found were thin, hesitant, sometimes leading nowhere at all. They walked longer now, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. The hunters left at first light and returned not with meat, but with stories. Stories of vanished herds, of dry trails that ended in nothing. Spears came back clean, nets came back empty, and eyes came back dull. There was no shame in the silence that followed, just the heaviness of knowing the land was no longer giving. The old places, the gullies, the shaded clearings, the water holes, had changed. Where once animals had gathered, now there was only dust and the bones of those too slow to leave. Even the scavengers had begun to fade. The vultures circled higher and less often. The jackals still prowled, but they were desperate too, and thinner. Sometimes hunters saw them from afar and wondered if they were following the same scent of hope. Sometimes they simply stared at one another, neither side sure who the prey was anymore. The people didn't blame the river. The river had fed them, taught them, cradled their children, carved the path of their stories into the land. It had never belonged to them, only moved through them, like a spirit whose favor had finally shifted. Now its bones showed. Pebbles and stones once hidden now lay bare, sun-bleached and dry. Crocodile nests stood abandoned, their eggs cracked and still. Frogs had stopped singing. Even the reeds, once thick and alive with insects, now snapped underfoot like brittle arrows. Sometimes the hunters walked its length out of habit, eyes tracing what once was, ears listening for any movement in the silence. But silence had become the dominant sound. No rustle in the grass, no sudden splash, just the windless hush of absence. And yet, they still prepared for the hunt. The rituals didn't change, even as the purpose blurred. Spears were sharpened, not for what they would strike, but because the act of sharpening reminded them who they were. Paint was smeared on arms, not to scare prey, but to feel the weight of tradition. They moved in groups, crouched low, and scanned the horizon, not because they expected to find, but because forgetting how would mean losing something they weren't ready to give up. Some came back with lizards, others with insects, a few with nothing at all. But they kept hunting, not only for meat, but for a reason to keep walking. The river had gone silent. The animals had followed, but they remained, clinging to the motions, because movement still felt like life, and stopping would mean admitting that the savannah had turned its back. They lay where they had fallen, scattered across the cracked ground like forgotten offerings. The bodies of antelope, warthogs, smaller things too dry or too weak to keep moving. Flesh had long since withered under the relentless sun, peeling back from bone in leathery ribbons. Limbs stiffened, then gave way, sinking slowly into the fractures that split the earth like wounds too wide to close. Flies gathered in a thick, shimmering cloud above them, their buzz low and constant, like a prayer to rot. Not even the smell was sharp anymore. The air was too dry to carry it far. What remained was a dull, sour weight that hung around the carcasses like memory. Birds no longer circled above them. Nothing new arrived to feed. These were not part of the cycle now. These were its remnants. The cracks beneath were deep, too deep to measure and too many to map. Some opened wide enough to twist an ankle, others like veins, branching underfoot in silent threat. The ground no longer felt solid. It shifted beneath their steps, crumbling at the edges of footprints, groaning when weight pressed down. The people moved with caution now, not out of fear of what might rise from below, but of what they themselves might fall into. Once these lands had been hard-packed and rich with life. Now they were splitting apart, slow and deliberate, as if the savannah itself had decided to come undone. Sometimes the children would test the cracks with sticks, watching them vanish into darkness. There was nothing inside, only dry air, still and silent. Even the insects seemed reluctant to crawl there. Among the bones, stories formed. A rib cage picked clean became a reminder of migration too late. A skull, half buried in dust, marked the boundary of a drying pool. Some of the elders would glance at these remains and nod quietly. Not out of reverence, but recognition. Death had become familiar, not feared, not honored, simply expected. The flies did what the sun could not finish, and the earth took what was left. The bones didn't disappear, not yet. They lingered like signposts, bleached and brittle, speaking in the language of silence. Some were used, sharpened, scraped, broken open for what little marrow remained. Others were left, untouched, too fragile or too far gone to be of use. Even death had become selective, and still, they moved through it. Every step was a calculation, every path a memory. The young followed behind the old, not because they knew the way, but because their caution carved safety into the dirt. Feet left shallow prints, barely indented, careful not to disturb what rested below. No one spoke when passing the larger carcasses. There was nothing left to say. No surprise, no mourning, only heat and flies, and the endless crackle of dust beneath skin. The savannah had stopped hiding its dead. It left them exposed, a map of failure etched into the open, and the people, dusty and worn, walked among them as if moving through an ancient ruin built not by time, but by thirst. The salt came first, creeping out from under the skin like something trying to escape. It formed in patches, beneath the arms, behind the knees, along the curve of the back, and stayed there, refusing to dry. The heat was too heavy. It pressed against the skin not as light, but as weight, thick and unmoving, suffocating even in stillness. Sweat no longer ran in clean lines down the body. It clung, thick and sour, as if the air itself was turning back into flesh. With no breeze to carry it away, the salt built up in layers, crusting at the edges of the scalp, gathering in the hollows around the eyes. Skin that was once supple now cracked along old scars and folds, stinging with every motion. Scratching only made it worse. Fingers left trails behind, pale where salt gave way, raw where it didn't. The body, trying to cool itself, only managed to carve discomfort deeper. The fires burned low, if they burned at all. There was little wood left worth taking, and less energy to chase it down. What smoke they could summon came from damp roots or old dung, acrid and bitter, floating low to the ground where it mingled with the dust. The smoke didn't rise. It rolled. It slid sideways into sleeping spaces, into eyes already rubbed red from heat. It wrapped around mouths like cloth, made breathing feel like swallowing ash. The fire wasn't for cooking anymore. There wasn't enough to cook. It was for habit, for presence, for the way light flickered just enough to keep away what moved in the dark. But the smoke made tears pointless. The eyes wept without meaning, not from grief, not from hope, but from reflex. And then even that stopped. The body learned to resist. It sealed its own ducts, preserved the moisture, and endured the burn. Nights were the worst. Without the motion of day to distract from discomfort, the body became a prison of salt and sting. Lying down didn't bring relief. It simply spread the ache across new surfaces, pressed sweat into new creases. The fires sent their smoke into every corner, filling the lungs with a slow, burning heaviness. Some turned their faces away, others buried their mouths in cloth. But the taste was always there. Smoke, sweat, and dust, coating the tongue like something alive. Dreams blurred into waking, with no clean boundary. Images came hazy and bright, flashes of water, of cold wind, of rain striking skin clean. But they never lasted. Morning returned with the same heavy light, the same skin, the same sting. And yet, they kept tending the flames. Not because they needed warmth, but because they needed rhythm. A fire meant something was still being done. It was motion, even when the body was too tired to move. The smoke was a signal of presence, of persistence. It told the land that someone still watched, still breathed, still remained. Even as the salt thickened and the eyes burned, they leaned toward the fire not for comfort, but for memory. Not long ago, fire had meant food and safety and songs. Now it was smoke and sting. But they kept it anyway, letting it choke them gently, letting it blur the night, because letting it die would be worse. Letting it die would mean silence, and silence was heavier than any salt, more blinding than any smoke. They did not speak of what was coming, because they had no need to. The old ones had seen the patterns before, not in years or in seasons, but in the shape of cracks in the earth, in the way the birds flew without calling, in the heaviness of stillness that settled before everything changed. They did not measure time with moons or numbers. They watched for signs, how the roots tasted more bitter when pulled from the dirt, how the insects grew quiet even at dusk, how the animals began walking at strange hours. Their silence was not born of ignorance, but of certainty. When they looked to the sky, it wasn't to ask, it was to recognize. The same pale dome, the same stubborn clouds that refused to gather, the same dry wind that didn't shift. They had no words for it, but in their faces, something shifted. Eyes that once scanned the horizon now lingered longer on the ground, on the people, on the smallest of movements. The younger ones asked, but not directly. They hovered nearby when the old ones sat alone. They offered water or touched an arm in silence, hoping a story might be shared. Sometimes it was. But the stories came slowly, with long pauses, as if pulled from a place deeper than memory. Stories of the time the river didn't return for 3 moons, of days when vultures fought people for meat, of a child who was buried with a gourd full of dust because water had become sacred enough to imagine. The old ones did not share these to teach or to warn. They shared them because holding them alone had become too heavy. But when the questions came, will it rain? Will we survive? Will this end? They said nothing. They only looked at the horizon, where nothing moved, and exhaled softly, like something was already being mourned. Their bodies betrayed their thoughts. Knees bent slower, backs curved deeper. They stood less often, and when they did, they leaned on the memory of sturdier days. Their skin, folded by time, cracked open like the ground, revealing patches too dry to heal. But their eyes were sharp. They saw the way the children stopped playing in the mornings, how the women whispered more quietly over the ashes of old fires, how the hunters came back without speaking. They noticed when the roots that once gave a sip of water now came up dry. They noticed how the dreams changed, no longer of rain, but of walking. Always walking, away from something that used to be home. The old ones didn't cry. Their tears had dried many seasons ago. But they watched everything with the patience of those who had once waited for rain and knew what it cost. And when night fell, they sat apart. Not out of pride, but out of memory. They faced the sky without asking anything from it, their hands resting on their knees, their breathing slow and deep. The firelight caught their faces in lines of shadow, and the others glanced toward them, hoping for reassurance, for ritual, for anything that might feel like structure in the crumbling silence. But the old ones only sat. Their presence was enough. They had lived through something like this once, long ago, when they were young and the sky had forgotten how to weep. And though they had no promise to offer, their stillness spoke louder than comfort. It said, "Yes, this is how it begins, and yes, it will get worse before it changes. But we are still here, for now, and that too is something." It burned low now, barely more than a memory of fire, just embers tucked under brittle branches, flickering without conviction, casting no real light. The flame, when it came at all, was weak and colorless, curling in on itself as if ashamed to show its face. There was no warmth in it. People sat near it out of habit, not heat, their backs curved inward, their hands stretched toward something that no longer gave. The fire had once been the heart of their world, a place for food, for songs, for stories whispered into the night. Now it was a shadow of itself, sustained not by need, but by refusal. Letting it die would mean something worse than cold. It would mean surrender. So they fed it what they could. Crumbs of bark, dried dung, splinters of wood scavenged from the bones of fallen trees. Enough to keep it breathing. Barely. In the dark, it offered no protection. Animals that once feared flame no longer flinched at its dull glow. Insects crawled too close, unbothered by its heatless promise. Shadows moved around the edge of the camp, untamed and uninterested. And yet, they kept the fire. It marked the center, the place where the people still were. Even in silence, even without stories, it gave shape to their night. Without it, everything would be swallowed by the dark. The children stayed near it, not because they trusted it, but because the adults did. They watched it flicker with eyes that didn't blink, waiting for it to become something more. But it didn't. It never did. It hissed faintly, exhaled smoke that crawled along the ground, and whispered that it was still alive. But only just. Sometimes someone would poke it with a stick, hoping to rouse something deeper. A flare, a crackle, a breath of warmth. But the fire gave no reward. It shrank back, tired, and resumed its trembling glow. They stopped cooking on it. There was too little to cook and too little flame to trust. Now they ate what they could find raw or dried or chewed into submission. The fire served only itself. It needed tending but gave little in return. And still it was kept. As long as something burned, no matter how faint, it meant someone was watching. It meant someone was awake. In a landscape where everything else had given up, water, animals, even the river, this small thing held on. And that made it sacred in a way it never had been before. By morning, it would be gone again. A smear of gray on gray, cold ash, soft as breath, scattered by the first motion of wind or foot. But someone would kneel and press new tinder into it. A handful of straw, a piece of cloth, a shaving of bark. They would blow gently, not in hope but in rhythm, and wait for the smallest red glow to respond. When it did, however weakly, it would be enough. Not to warm, not to cook, just to say, we are still here. And fire, even without flame, still lives where we do. Not because we need it now, but because we once did and might again. And because letting it vanish would mean admitting we no longer believe it can return. They used to ask. Every morning, small voices broke the silence with the same question, hopeful and uncertain. Will it rain today? The words came with bright eyes and tilted heads, their gazes fixed upward, looking for something to change. They pointed at clouds, or at the wind, or at nothing at all, and asked again, even if they had been answered already. The repetition was part of the rhythm, of mourning, of hunger, of waiting. Adults answered gently at first, with stories or reassurances, pointing to the horizon, or telling them how the birds once flew before the rains came. But the days stretched on. The clouds never changed. The sky remained flat and dry. And the questions stopped. Not all at once, but gradually, like a drum beat slowing down until it faded entirely. The children stopped pointing. They stopped looking. Their voices grew quiet. Now, when they woke, they simply looked at the ground. The silence of children is different from that of adults. Adults grow quiet with worry, with knowledge, with the heaviness of memory. Children grow quiet because they learn to, because repetition without reward teaches them something no words can undo. The child who once asked now walked slowly across the dry earth, dragging a stick through the dust, tracing patterns no one would ever see. His feet left soft impressions that the wind would erase before dusk. He no longer asked about the sky. He watched the cracks in the soil instead. He crouched to study ants carrying things too large, or followed the path of a beetle until it vanished into nothing. There was no curiosity in it, only observation. A quiet registering of what is, not what could be. His face, once animated by questions, now held the same stillness as the elders. Not because he understood, but because he had accepted what they had long known. Around the fire, when it still smoldered, he sat without fidgeting. Once he would have thrown bits of bark into the flame or tried to feed it too much at once, laughing as sparks flew up into the night. Now he sat with his hands in his lap, eyes reflecting the same dull glow as the dying embers. He didn't ask about the animals either, or the river. He knew the answers already, and the knowledge settled on him like dust. Quiet, fine, everywhere. Sometimes he would glance at the sky, but not to look for rain, just to measure how empty it remained. The clouds that passed were too high, too thin, more like ghosts than signs. He didn't point at them. He didn't speak of them. He watched them like someone watching distant figures leave and knew they wouldn't return. The others noticed, but no one said anything. A child's silence carried its own weight, and to name it would be to admit that something had broken. So they let it be. They let him move through the camp in silence, his bare feet dark with dust, his face lined with a seriousness that didn't belong to him. He wasn't alone. Other children had quieted too. Games had ceased. Laughter had thinned. What once filled the air with shouts and movement now felt like the echo of something lost. Their eyes, too young to be weary, now held the long, dry stare of waiting without expectation. And in that stillness, in that hush where questions used to live, the savannah stretched wider, the sky loomed lower, and the world turned slower, carrying them forward in silence. The stones had never truly been forgotten, only set aside during gentler times when the land gave enough to dull their edges. But now the ground was harder, and the need more immediate. The people returned to the old stones, the ones buried at the edge of memory, where ancestors had once shaped them with repetition and silence. Fingers searched through the dust for flint, for obsidian, for anything with a bite. Not every stone would do. It had to feel right in the hand, heavy enough to matter, smooth enough to guide, brittle enough to break just so. Knees pressed into the soil, hands curled around stone, and the first sparks of purpose flickered back into the world. Not fire, but function. Not for meat or skins or trophies, but for scraping, cutting, stripping bark from roots, slicing insects apart for the watery paste inside. Survival required sharpness now, not just of edge but of intention. The shaping came quietly. There were no chants, no instructions, just the soft rhythm of strike and chip. A blow from one rock against another, a small shard falling away, then another. The shape revealed itself slowly, not created but uncovered, like something already inside the stone waiting to be freed. Children watched in silence, learning not through lessons but through time. The old ones showed them not by speaking, but by doing, placing their thumbs just so, rotating the core, adjusting the pressure of each strike. The flakes that scattered across the ground gleamed faintly in the light, each one a memory of necessity. Some would be bound to sticks for digging, others used plane in the hand, small blades with edges that could slice hide or split reeds. There was no waste. Even broken tools had weight, and weight had value. They used the new edges without hesitation. There was no luxury of testing or perfecting. Bark was peeled from trees already near death, their cores scraped for moisture and fiber. Insects were caught and cracked open, their shells stripped clean. When they found small animals, lizards, birds too weak to flee, their bodies were opened with the stones, not out of cruelty, but with the clarity of hunger. Every part was taken. Bones snapped for marrow, sinew pulled for binding, skin dried to be used or chewed. The tools dulled quickly, but so did hands. Blisters opened, bled, and healed again. Calluses formed where pain had once lived. They sharpened the blades again and again, not waiting for them to fail. There was no room for delay. Dull meant danger. Hesitation meant hunger. And still, the people kept making more. Even when the immediate need was met, they continued to shape stones, piling them in small clusters near the center of the camp. Not for decoration, not even for readiness, but for reassurance. The presence of tools meant possibility. It meant they still had control over something, even as the world fell away. The sound of stone striking stone became a kind of heartbeat in the dry air, a dull percussion that grounded them. They didn't speak of it. They didn't have to. Every chip, every edge, every flake said the same thing. We are not done yet. We are not nothing yet. We may not hunt, we may not thrive, but we still cut. We still shape. We still act. And in the absence of rain, in the absence of plenty, that was what survival became. Edges honed by necessity, hands guided by memory, and the silent determination to make something sharp, even from stone. They dug with their hands because tools slowed the process. Fingers were faster, more sensitive to change, more attuned to texture. Beneath the sparse trees, acacia, baobab, the twisted bones of others whose names had been lost, they clawed at the dirt, scraping aside the brittle top layer in hope of something darker, something cooler, something alive. It wasn't called water anymore, not in the way it had once been. They searched instead for signs of it. Dampness, resistance, a smell like clay. Even the faintest wetness was enough to keep going, to keep scraping, to press palms flat against the pit and feel something other than powder. They knew the good trees by memory, the ones whose roots reached deepest, the ones that still cast shade even if barely. These were not the trees you sat under. These were the tree you begged from. Sometimes they found it, moist soil just barely sticky, clinging to fingers like promise. It wasn't drinkable, not yet. But it meant water was near, hidden in the veins of roots, waiting to be coaxed. They dug deeper, not with force, but with care. Roots could bleed, could snap, could die if handled wrong, and dead roots meant no second chance. The older ones showed the younger how to twist the wrist, how to scoop from the sides, how to leave space for breath beneath the tree. When the soil thickened, they pressed it to their tongues, sucking at it slowly, not for taste, but for relief. Wet clay filled the mouth with the weight of earth, but it soothed the throat just enough. Sometimes they wrung the roots themselves, wrapped them in cloth, crushed them against bark, collected the drops that trembled free. A few drops were victory. A handful was a gift. The children were sent first, not because they were expendable, but because their hands were small. They could reach deeper, feel finer shifts in moisture, dig without collapsing the fragile hollow forming below the trunk. Their fingernails turned black with soil, their wrists bruised against stones. But they kept going, quiet and methodical, digging one shallow bowl after another. The women came next, carrying gourds or shells to collect whatever seeped from the ground. They worked in silence, surrounded by the dry whisper of leaves above and the heavier silence of the cracked earth below. They never spoke while digging. Words broke focus. Breathing had to be slow, movement deliberate. Wasted energy was a crime now, so they moved with the rhythm of necessity, of repetition, of knowing this might be the only place left with anything to give. When they didn't find water, they didn't cry. Crying wasted what they were trying to find. They simply moved to the next tree and the next, until dusk turned the ground to shadow and fingers could no longer feel the difference between dirt and skin. Then they stood, covered in dust, empty vessels still clutched in hand, and turned back toward camp. No one asked what they'd found. They could see the answer in the way shoulders sagged or didn't, in how someone carried their gourd, with reverence or with resignation. What little they brought back was shared, poured into bowls and left to settle. Clay would sink, water would rise. Even if cloudy, even if bitter, it was life. Not enough to fill, but enough to continue. Just enough to go back the next morning and dig again. Because as long as the roots still reached deep, there was hope. And if not hope, then habit. And habit could keep a body moving long after hope had gone dry. They moved like secrets, slow, deliberate, unseen until it was too late. The scorpions had not left, had not thinned like the herds, had not cried out like the people. They had simply adapted, as they always had. Their bodies knew this heat. Their shells absorbed it, reflected it, blended into it. They crept along the cracks of the savannah with a kind of confidence that no longer belonged to anything else alive. In the cool hours before dawn, they emerged from the earth, their pincers twitching, their tails arched with quiet readiness. They weren't hunting in desperation. They were existing, surviving, feeding when needed, hiding when not. They lived in places too narrow for fingers, too deep for firelight, too quiet for sound. The people envied them, not openly, but in the stillness of their gaze, as they watched a scorpion vanish into a fissure like smoke into night. While others burned under the sun, the scorpions found shadow. They slipped beneath stones that held the last whispers of the night's coolness. They dug into the sides of riverbeds where the last damp soil clung in silence. They drank not from pools, but from the air itself, sipping moisture from the undersides of rocks, from dew trapped in crevices where even the dust couldn't reach. The people watched this and understood. The scorpions were not lucky. They were just better suited to a world that no longer bent toward humans. They needed less, expected less. Their rhythm was not broken by hunger or thirst. They moved when it was time and waited when it was not. No lament, no longing. Just endurance pure and complete. It wasn't a life to admire, perhaps, but it was one that lasted. The children learned to spot them quickly, not out of fear, but from necessity. A scorpion meant something was still living beneath the soil. Where it walked, there might still water. Where it dug, there might still roots worth pulling. They watched where it paused, where it hesitated, where it disappeared. It became a kind of map, not of abundance, but of possibility. Even the elders paid attention now. A scorpion scuttling through camp at dusk wasn't something to crush, but something to consider. It was a sign, a shape of movement that defied the emptiness growing all around. Sometimes they captured them, not to kill, but to study. In bowls, in gourds, in hands cupped cautiously, they observed how the creatures moved, how they navigated the cracks, how they positioned themselves beneath fallen bark or in the shadows cast by stones. There was knowledge in that. They never domesticated them. That would have been foolish. The scorpion belonged to no one. But in their small presence, the people found a rhythm worth mimicking. They moved slower, stayed closer to the ground, searched with patience instead of urgency. They began to see the land not as a thing to take from, but a thing to listen to. The scorpion was a whisper, a reminder. That surviving wasn't about strength or fire or hunger. It was about quiet persistence, about taking only what was needed, about knowing when to move and when to stay still, And in a world that had stopped giving, that kind of knowledge was more valuable than any tool. So the people followed the scorpions, not with reverence but with respect, because when the earth turned against them, it was the small, quiet things that still knew how to live. No one spoke to the sky anymore, not because they had stopped believing, but because belief had sunk deeper than words. The dry air took too much from a voice. Moisture, strength, meaning. And so the prayers became quieter, until they ceased to be spoken at all. But they hadn't disappeared. They had only changed shape. They lived now in the smallest gestures, a hand pressed flat against the earth before rising, a moment of stillness beneath the trees before digging, the way someone paused and looked toward the west before sleep. These were not rituals in the old sense. They were instinctual, private, shaped by repetition and necessity. There were no chants, no names invoked, no gods called upon by name. There was only breath, dust, skin, and the silence between footsteps. And that silence was heavy, not empty, but full of everything that could no longer be said. The people no longer turned their faces upward to plead. Instead, their foreheads leaned into the ground, not in reverence, but in surrender. In the coolness of early morning, some knelt where the soil was softest, pressing their palms flat into the dirt, as if listening, as if offering something of themselves in exchange for one drop of mercy. It was not performative. No one watched each other do it. There were no ceremonies, no shared timing, only scattered acts of stillness, one by the fire pit, another near the edge of the cracked riverbed, another crouched low beside a dying tree. These moments did not ask for intervention. They acknowledged absence. They honored the waiting. They held space for something larger than drought, deeper than fear. The silence was not empty. It was crowded with meaning, with longing, with fatigue, with a kind of quiet awe that survived even now. The children mimicked the posture without knowing its meaning. They copied the stillness of the elders, the downward glance, the curled spine, the pressed lips. It soothed them, not because they understood, but because silence, when shared, can be more powerful than comfort. Some traced shapes in the dust, circles, spirals, the lines of animal tracks long gone. Others stacked stones in towers no higher than a finger, only to knock them down again with the tip of one toe. These too were prayers, whether they knew it or not. The body needed somewhere to place its hope, its confusion, its hunger. And with words failing, the gestures became language. A gourd filled with shadow, a leaf placed gently on the cracked earth, a finger dragged slowly across a bone. It was all communication. Not with the divine, perhaps, but with the space around them, with the land, with time. And when night fell, and the fires breathed their last heatless sighs, the people lay still. They didn't whisper to one another. There were no bedtime stories now, no songs, only the sound of limbs settling into dust, of exhalations pressed tight against the ribs. The darkness carried no promises, and so they asked for nothing from it. But their bodies still prayed. In the way arms curled around bellies, in the way backs turned toward the wind, in the way eyes closed not in sleep, but in surrender. These were the prayers that remained, wordless, voiceless, endless. Not declarations, not bargains, just presence, just being. And in that being, in that shared breath beneath an unchanging sky, something sacred endured. Something that didn't need a name or a story or a god, only silence, and the will to continue inside it. They stared not because they expected something, but because they didn't know what else to do. The horizon had become more than a line. It was a presence, a fixed place where all their questions were cast and none returned. Eyes found it without effort, in the pauses between tasks, in the stillness before night, in the heavy silence of dawn. Gazes drifted there, to that distant seam where sky met earth with no promise, no shape, no movement. It was vast and indifferent, flat and unreachable, and yet it held them. Like something older than memory, it called them forward even as they remained frozen in place. The youngest stared with blankness, the oldest with recognition. It was not a place where rain came from anymore. It was a god with no face, no voice, no favor. And yet they worshipped it with their silence, day after day. Sometimes someone would lift a hand toward it, shielding their eyes from the sun or measuring some imagined shift in light. But the hand always fell, empty. The horizon gave nothing back. No cloud built itself there. No figure approached. No wind stirred. Still, they watched it, not to measure hope, but to bear witness. If change was ever going to come, it would come from that edge. If salvation, or storm, or something else entirely ever moved across the land again, it would have to start there. So they gave it their attention, quietly, without expectation, like a ritual too deeply embedded to abandon. Some squinted, trying to make meaning from mirage. Others simply let their eyes glaze over, letting the distance blur into something less painful than the near. There was comfort in the far. It didn't ask anything from them. It didn't disappoint. It simply was. The earth around them shifted with heat, cracked and splintered beneath their feet, but their gazes stayed fixed outward. They stopped noticing how long they looked. Minutes passed. Hours. Some stared while chewing, others while resting, heads tilted just slightly as if listening. But there was nothing to hear. The horizon made no sound. It moved only with the sun from east to west, repeating its silent arc without effort, without mercy. They tried not to assign meaning to it. They knew better, but their bodies betrayed them. Each glance carried the echo of the old belief that something would rise from the distance, that a shape might form, that a line of darkness might signal rain. But nothing formed. The line remained clean, blank, immutable. It was a boundary not between places, but between hope and surrender. And yet, despite everything, they never turned their backs to it. Even in sleep, they arranged themselves with faces toward the edge. Even in death, when someone passed, the body was laid flat, head tilted slightly to the horizon, as if the final breath might still reach across that distance. The land had taught them that nothing came easily, that nothing came often, but the horizon remained. A god not of blessings, but of permanence. A presence that did not judge, did not change, did not answer, only received. And in that receiving, the people found something like peace. Not comfort, not joy, not even understanding, just a place to rest their eyes when there was nowhere else to look. A place to cast their breath when it became too heavy to hold. A place that didn't ask for faith, only for silence. And that was all they had left to give. The gourd sat in the center of the circle, small and silent, as if it understood the weight it carried. No one touched it at first. They only looked at it, some with dry eyes, others with cracked lips pressed tight, but all with the same knowledge. This was the last. Not the last forever, but the last for now. For today, for however long it would take before another root bled or another tree offered shade. The gourd was round, worn smooth from many hands, the color of old bark, with a stopper made from a twist of reed and cloth. Inside it sloshed the faintest sound of life, a thin film of water clinging to the walls, no more than a mouthful or two. But they didn't count it. They didn't measure. That would have made it too small. Instead, they waited, letting the moment stretch. When someone finally lifted it, they did so with both hands, as if cradling a newborn animal. There were no words spoken. Words implied choice, and there was none here. The gourd had to be shared. That was known as deeply as the sky was dry. The first sip was not a sip at all, just a tilt against the lips, enough to wet them, enough to remember what softness felt like. Then it was passed, hand to hand, without urgency. Each person drank in their own way, some quickly, some slowly, some only pretending, letting the water touch their tongue and nothing more. No one looked at each other. There was no judgment, no tracking of fairness. The silence held everything in place. Fairness was not the point. Need had a rhythm, and each person knew their place in it. The children were given what remained, not out of sentiment, but necessity. Their bodies dried faster, cracked faster, faded faster. The smallest sat close, watching the gourd move around the circle, eyes wide but still, their breathing shallow. When it reached them, hands larger than theirs helped tip it gently. A few drops clung to the rim and slipped into waiting mouths. A cough followed, soft and startled, as if the throat had forgotten how to receive. Then it was done. The gourd was empty. Not in the dramatic sense, but in the quiet way that things become spent and don't need to say so. It was set down again, still upright, as if still full, as if holding space for something to return. No one mourned out loud. There was no crying, no lament. Only a kind of collective exhale, a shift in posture, a soft returning of limbs to their own weight. The circle remained unbroken. No one rose immediately. They sat with the absence of water like they had with its presence, together, in stillness. The gourd, though drained, was not discarded. It would be rinsed when they next found water, used again, trusted again. Because its emptiness didn't make it useless. It was a vessel, and vessels were sacred not because they were full, but because they could be. And so they waited, not for another gourd, but for the world to fill it again. And while they waited, they held on to the memory of how it felt in their hands. Round, cool, heavy with hope, and passed that memory between them in silence. The sun had begun its descent, dragging its light slowly across the sky, but the heat did not follow. Instead, it lingered in the soil, in the bones, in the breath. The shadows stretched longer, growing out across the cracked ground like fingers reaching for something already gone. But they offered no comfort. They moved as if guided by ancient rhythms, elongating behind stones, trees, and bodies. But the air around them remained thick and motionless, There was no wind to stir the edges, no coolness to wrap around tired limbs. The shade was only darkness now, an absence of light, not an absence of heat. The people sat inside it, hoping out of habit more than reason, hoping that maybe this time the lengthening shadow would bring relief. But it never did. It merely moved, silent and indifferent, like everything else that had stopped listening. The rocks, warmed by a day's worth of sun, radiated heat from every surface. Touching them was like pressing a hand against a wound. Even in the deepest part of the camp, where once a canopy of branches had softened the sun, there was now only stillness. The trees no longer gave shelter. Their leaves hung limp, brittle, lifeless. Their shadows, thin as ribbons, flickered across the ground without purpose. People avoided them now, not out of fear, but futility. The shade had turned against them, not violently, but passively, as if even it had grown tired. Sitting within it felt no different than standing in the open. The body continued to sweat, and the sweat no longer evaporated. It clung, thick and salty, refusing to offer even the illusion of cooling. The skin itched and stung, as if trying to warn of danger long past. And the air, silent, unmoving, felt heavier than flesh. Some still tried to rest as the day slipped away. They stretched out on mats of woven grass, or lay directly on the dirt, arms splayed, eyes closed. But rest did not come easily. The heat clung to the chest, pressed against the lungs, made every breath shallow. Dreams, when they came, were bright and frantic, visions of water running over skin, of cool caves, of wind. But waking brought only more of the same, light fading, but warmth still burning just below the surface. The horizon turned gold, then red, then bruised blue. Still the earth glowed with yesterday's heat, unwilling to let go. Feet burned against the soil, backs stuck to bedding. Even the insects had slowed, their buzzing more sluggish, their wings rising only when necessary. Nothing moved fast anymore, not even discomfort. And yet, the people stayed outside. Not to feel the cool, but to chase it. They watched the shadows drift, hoping they might deepen, might change. But the change was only in shape, not in substance. As the light curled away and the first stars blinked into place, the heat remained, embedded in everything. It had become a second skin, one that no shadow could peel away. Children sat still, their faces flushed and quiet. Elders leaned on knees, staring at the ground. No one reached for water. There was none to reach for. No one lit the fire. It was already too hot. And so they waited, not for nightfall, but for the illusion that night might bring peace. But peace did not come with the dark. Only more silence, more weight, and shadows that promised nothing except that tomorrow would begin again. Already warm, already heavy, already full of a heat that even the longest shadow could not undo. They didn't speak of dreams, not because they didn't have them, but because they were afraid of what they meant. At night, when the body softened and the silence stretched without end, something inside loosened. Sleep came slowly, dragging its feet through the heat. But when it arrived, it brought strange gifts. And the most painful of all was the smell. It came before the images, before the rivers, the trees, the sky. It drifted into the mind like smoke through a crack, sudden and overwhelming, the smell of wet earth. Rich, thick, alive. It filled the chest like breath should, It pressed against the skin, cool and familiar. Sometimes it was mixed with the scent of bark or moss or wind curling through grass still slick with morning. It didn't matter what came with it. The earth was enough. In that moment, in that dream, something ancient stirred, something that remembered how it felt to stand in mud instead of dust, to drink from a stream instead of a cracked bowl. The dreams built around that smell. Some dreamed of rain falling on their upturned faces, of droplets tracing lines through sweat and salt. Others walked in green places where water dripped from leaves and soaked their feet with every step. There were no words in these dreams, no voices, no questions, only sensation. Hands sinking into damp soil, knees pressed against moss, mouths open to the sky. These were not memories. They were inventions, longings given shape. No one alive had felt these things in weeks, maybe longer. But the dreams insisted. They returned night after night, cruel in their beauty, gentle in their deception. They felt real enough to cling to, but they always slipped away. And when morning came, it came with dust in the mouth, grit in the eyes, and the sharp, sour truth that nothing had changed. Waking was a kind of heartbreak. The body shifted, slow and sore, still clinging to the last shreds of coolness that had never been there. Eyes opened to the same cracked ceiling of sky, the same silence, the same weight. For a few seconds, the scent lingered, not in the air, but in the mind. The body believed it for just a breath longer, and then it was gone, replaced by the smell of smoke, of sweat, of old bark and worn cloth. Some tried to fall back asleep, to catch it again, to slip back into the place where the world had not yet dried out. But it never worked. The dream knew when it was no longer welcome. It receded into the heat, leaving behind only absence. And in that absence, something hardened, something closed. The dream would return, yes, but it would be harder to believe next time. Still, no one spoke of it. To name the dream would be to name the hunger behind it. To say aloud that your body had invented rain was to admit how badly it needed it. And so they kept quiet. They rose without ceremony, brushed dust from skin, moved through the morning like shadows in their own lives. But the smell haunted them. It lingered behind the eyes, in the hollow of the throat, in the palms of their hands. A memory that wasn't real, but felt more true than anything else. It was the only rain they had now. Rain made of memory, of wish, of dust twisted into something softer for just a little while. And though they did not say it, they all dreamed it. And they all woke the same way, dry, aching, and staring at the sky, wondering how something that had never arrived could feel so close. The footprints told the story before anyone spoke. A line of them stretched across the dry ground, uneven, close together, some shallow, others deep. In the center of each, a dark spot bloomed, barely red in the colorless light, more rust than blood. But it was blood. It soaked into the dust, where it clung in muddy clusters before being baked flat by the sun. The prints continued past the tree line, past the stones, into a patch of cracked earth that had once been the shallow edge of a river. There they faded, not because the bleeding stopped, but because the earth no longer cared to mark it. The person had walked barefoot for too long, too far, with skin too dry to bend and too thin to last. The souls had given up their flesh in layers. First blister, then break, then surrender. Each step was an offering, not to a god, but to the road itself. No one asked whose blood it was. They didn't need to. They had all felt the tearing, the sting, the throb that followed. It didn't matter whose feet had opened this time. It would be someone else next. They knew the rhythm of it, the moment when numbness became pain, and pain became heat, and heat became nothing at all. That moment when the body walked not from strength, but from refusal to stop. Even after the skin split, after the bones pushed too close to the surface, they walked. Because the walking was survival, because stopping was defeat. Sometimes they wrapped their feet in cloth, in bark, in old hides softened over flame. But those things didn't last. They wore through in hours, and when the sun hit the center of the sky and the earth turned white with heat, there was no barrier thick enough to protect skin. The ground burned through everything, even the will. When the footprints came back through the camp, they left smudges of red across sleeping mats and stones. Someone washed them without comment, using a handful of sand and the corner of a rag already stiff with other stains. The person who had bled sat nearby, their legs stretched out, heels crusted with dust and dried red. No one pitied them. No one pitied anyone. That wasn't cruelty. It was economy. Pity didn't heal. Pity didn't find roots or pull water from the bark of a dying tree. So they simply acknowledged it with silence. A shared glance. A tightened jaw. Someone passed a gourd with a few drops left. Someone else tore a piece of cloth from the hem of their wrap. The wound would be cleaned, wrapped, ignored. Tomorrow, they would walk again. Whether the foot healed or not was beside the point. The road didn't wait for skin, but the blood remained. For a while at least. It dried into the cracks, marked the path, made the invisible visible. It reminded the others that there was still flesh beneath the dust, that the body could still break. And in a strange way, that was a comfort. Because it meant they hadn't yet turned to stone. They were still human, still bleeding, still leaving parts of themselves behind as they moved forward. The Savannah could take their water, their sleep, their speech, but the blood was given. It didn't come freely. It came with weight. And every drop that darkened the ground said the same thing. We are still here. Still walking, still alive enough to hurt. And for now, that was enough. The songs had no tune now, no melody to rise or fall. They moved through the air like breath held too long, like speech abandoned halfway to sound. Women hummed them as they worked with their hands, cleaning gourds, weaving brittle grass, pressing bark to soften it into something that might hold water. The sounds that came weren't quite music, but they repeated with purpose. A syllable, then another, a pause, then a sound low in the chest, barely more than vibration. The rhythm mattered more than the pitch. These weren't songs for celebration. They weren't even songs for comfort. They were songs to remember what had been sung before, songs held in the shape of the mouth, in the pulse of the body, in the movement of fingers that needed something to follow. They didn't fill the silence. They slipped through it, like threads pulled from the past and laid gently across the present. Children sometimes tried to echo them, but they didn't know the words. No one had spoken the words in a long time. Maybe the words had never really mattered. The tune had been forgotten first, melted away by heat, scraped down by dust. Then the meaning, buried somewhere between thirst and sleep. What was left was repetition, a soft insistence, something that kept time when the sun refused to move fast enough. The voices were low and dry, barely pushing air past the teeth, and the songs never rose above the sound of footsteps or wind. But they were there, always there. In the early morning, when the ground was still cool, at midday, when shade vanished, at night, when the body wanted to disappear. The songs lingered. They were never finished, never fully begun. They just circled, like breath in the throat. Men sang too, but not in groups. Their sounds were different, shorter, sharper, almost like muttering. Not to themselves, but to time. While digging, while sharpening stone, while staring at the place where the horizon met their memory. One syllable, then another. Not loud, not soft, not hopeful. Just there. Some tapped stones together in rhythm. Others knocked their teeth gently, a jaw pulse that shaped a pattern. The body needed rhythm. When food was scarce and water invisible, rhythm became the only thing that fed the brain. A way to trick the nerves into staying awake. A way to tell the limbs they still had a reason to move. The songs held that rhythm. They wrapped around the bones, not the ears. And so, even when silence seemed absolute, the sound still traveled, through the dust, through the breath, through the hearts that still beat, even slowly. No one ever asked what the songs meant. That wasn't the point. Meaning had dried up with the rivers. What mattered was the continuation. That sound had not disappeared completely. That the voice, though cracked and faint, still moved in time with something older than language. The songs were memory, but not of specific events. They were memory of being, of once having more than this, of once walking not toward survival, but alongside it. And so they sang, without melody, without music, without strength, just a soft, persistent rhythm that tied one breath to the next. And in that rhythm, in that barely audible presence, they remembered, not the rain, not the animals, not even the words, but themselves. The fact that they were still human, still singing, still here. They had always been there, watching, waiting, moving just beyond the reach of firelight. But now the jackals no longer waited. The distance they kept had grown smaller, as if the line between wild and human had blurred with the heat, with the thirst, with the endless quiet. At night, their eyes shone closer than before, not as flickers in the distance, but as small, steady points just beyond the edge of the camp. They didn't bark, didn't yip, didn't announce themselves. They stood in silence, watching, sometimes crouched low, sometimes standing still, sometimes padding slowly in a wide, patient arc. They didn't threaten, they didn't lunge, but they were always seen. The glint of their gaze came like a pulse, low to the ground, unwavering. The people noticed, but didn't startle. There was no energy for fear, only a deeper awareness, a quiet understanding that the watchers were moving in. During the day, they left no tracks. The wind erased them, or the earth swallowed them, dry and indifferent. But the people knew where the jackals had walked. Bones that had been scattered were now rearranged, ash piles disturbed, small things missing. A gourd left outside showed faint teeth marks near its rim. The camp was being tested, not attacked, but measured. Every night, the animals came closer. Every morning, they withdrew, leaving no signs of violence, just a little less distance. The line between the living and the desperate thinned with every sunset. Once, jackals waited until all was still. Now they moved while fires still smoldered. Their patience had become boldness, not because they were predators, but because hunger erodes the boundary between caution and need. Like the people, the jackals had adapted. Like the people, they were still looking for scraps in a place that no longer offered anything freely. Children stopped playing near the edge of the camp, not because anyone told them to, but because the silence there felt different now. It hummed with breath that wasn't theirs. The older ones began placing stones in wide arcs, not to block, but to mark, to show where the light ended and the watchers began. Some laid bones out in patterns, not as warning, but as language, hoping the jackals might understand territory. But animals didn't need maps. They understood presence. They smelled exhaustion. They listened to sleep. And when the breathing slowed across the camp, they came closer. Soft steps, low sniffs, no growls. Just proximity. The people didn't lash out. They tightened their circles, placed sleeping children between bodies, listened harder. Because a jackal, unlike drought, unlike sun, could move, could strike, could tear. But it hadn't. Not yet. It only lingered, waiting for a moment weaker than this one. And so, night became a shared negotiation. The people curled tighter around the fireless center. The jackals watched longer, listened closer. The space between them became a breath, a blink, a whisper. Still no violence came, only presence. A mutual acknowledgement. You are suffering, and so are we. In another time, the people might have driven them off with stone and voice. Now they offered nothing, not threat, not welcome, just stillness, just the hard edge of coexisting need. Eyes met eyes through the dark, yellow, and human, equally dry, and each side in its own language asked the same question the land refused to answer. How long can we keep living like this? It began as a low vibration, too distant to name. At first, they mistook it for wind moving through dead trees or for the stomach of the earth shifting in its sleep. But then it came again, rounder, deeper, unmistakable. Thunder, real thunder. It rolled slowly across the savannah like a forgotten drum, too far to touch, but close enough to make the breath catch. Heads lifted, hands stilled. Someone pointed without meaning to. Others turned toward the sound with eyes that hadn't held brightness in days. Thunder. A sound older than language. It meant rain. It meant movement. It meant the sky hadn't forgotten them entirely. But as they waited, as they searched the sky for shapes, for promise, for even the thinnest thread of cloud, they saw nothing. The sky remained flat and pale, stained only by distance, and the thunder did not bring its companion. They listened harder, as if the force of their attention might pull the clouds into being. The thunder returned, again and again, each time a little closer, or maybe just louder. It filled the chest, echoed in bones. Children whispered, unsure whether to feel hope or fear. Elders squinted at the horizon and said nothing. The air should have changed. It should have cooled, thickened, shifted. But it didn't. The heat stayed the same. Dry, absolute. The dust did not lift. The wind did not stir. The birds did not rise. Only the sound changed, and that was the cruelest part. Because thunder doesn't come alone. That was the rule. That was the pattern. But this thunder came empty, a voice with no body, a sound with no answer. The sky rumbled like a promise, but it gave nothing. It lied. For hours it continued, moving across the land in waves, sometimes faint, sometimes loud enough to tremble the teeth. They watched. They waited. They tasted the air for signs. The elders sniffed for moisture, held their palms up, searched the hairs on their arms for that first electric thrill. But nothing came. The thunder cracked once, sharp and sudden, and someone cried out, not from fear, but from betrayal. The children had begun to speak again, asking questions with words they'd forgotten how to use. Will it rain? Is it coming? Are the clouds hiding? But the answers didn't follow. The sky gave them sound to stir the memory of hope, and then silence to kill it. When night fell, the last roll of thunder faded into the dark without even a gust of wind to mark its passing. No lightning, no clouds. Only dust, thicker than ever, clinging to skin like punishment. By morning, they no longer spoke of it. The thunder was treated like a dream too vivid to believe in daylight. A sound that should have meant salvation had become something else. Another weight, another emptiness dressed in noise. They moved slower than usual, not because they were tired, but because they were heavier inside. The sky had spoken, but not with kindness. It had stirred every instinct, every buried hope, and then disappeared, leaving them more hollow than before. Even the children stopped asking. Even the elders stopped glancing upward. The thunder had lied. And the worst part was not the lie itself, but how badly they had wanted to believe it. The sound had echoed inside them as much as over the land, and now, in its silence, something else echoed too. The truth that not every noise means change, and not every sky remembers how to keep its word. It began around the knuckles, small fissures, like the cracks in dry soil, branching outward with each movement of the fingers. They didn't bleed at first, just opened slightly, then widened, then deepened with every task. The skin grew tight, pulled taut over bone, shiny in places where it stretched too far, and dull where it thickened. Across arms and shoulders, flakes appeared like wind-blown dust. On calves and heels, the skin hardened, turned rough, then broke. No ointment, no oil, no spit could soften it. The body was becoming something else, less soft, less human, more landscape. If the Savannah had crept inside them, it had done so slowly, replacing moisture with memory, smoothness with grit. A hand held up to the sun looked like the back of a broken stone, elbows turned to bark. Faces bore the patterns of the land they lived on. They were becoming terrain. Touch changed. Where once fingers met skin with quiet friction, now they scraped, catching on corners of ribs and edges of spines. Embraces grew tentative, not out of fear, but because it hurt. Not to give or to receive, just to make contact. The body recoiled from itself. Even sitting became painful. Thighs against knees, shoulders against backs, every press a reminder that softness had disappeared. Only the eyes remained untouched, wet, blinking, alive. But the skin around them split with every squint, every expression. Smiles tore open new cracks. Frowns settled into permanent ridges. The heat spared nothing. Each hour under the sun was another step toward erosion. Even the hair, once thick and coarse, thinned and frayed, brittle as straw. It broke off in clumps or fell silently in the night, becoming just another thread in the dust. No one remarked on the change. There were no mirrors, no vanity. They saw themselves only in each other, and what they saw looked the same. Skin that no longer held moisture, backs that looked like hills, feet like riverbeds. Mothers traced the maps of dryness across their children's arms, recognizing the terrain, the familiar terrain of suffering shared. Lovers touched with reverence, not desire. Contact was no longer for pleasure. It was for checking damage, for measuring depth, for feeling the outline of bones through crusted flesh. They rubbed ash into wounds, pressed warm stones against aching joints, tried to hold the body together even as it unraveled. The old ones said nothing. They had already looked like earth before the drought. Now they only seemed closer to home. And yet the body endured. Even as it hardened, cracked, turned pale or gray with dust, it kept moving, kept lifting, carrying, digging, walking. The skin screamed with every stretch, but the muscles obeyed. Blisters burst and dried in the same hour. Wounds didn't close. They simply stopped bleeding. The body had stopped waiting for healing. It had learned to move forward, broken. And in that, there was a kind of defiance. If the skin wanted to become earth, so be it. But the people would not lie down and join it. Not yet. They would keep walking, cracked and aching, their bodies shaped by the same forces that shaped the ground. They would become terrain with intention. And in doing so, they would claim their place in the silence, not as victims, not as relics, but as the living outline of a world that refused to vanish. The air wasn't gone, but it had become something heavier, something to ration. Breathing, once effortless and forgotten, was now an act of discipline. Each inhale was taken with care, slow and shallow, measured against the effort it would require to exhale again. No one panted anymore, not even after long walks or hard labor. To pant was to waste. To gasp was indulgent. Breaths were small, almost invisible, taken low in the chest, with lips closed tight and nostrils flaring only when necessary. The lungs had adapted to silence, to heat, to dust. They didn't ask for more than they needed, and even when they needed more, they learned not to ask. A deeper breath might bring grit, might crack something in the throat, might stir a cough that could burn for hours. So they breathed like they drank, rarely, carefully, sparingly. Air, like water, was no longer free. It wasn't the heat that made it hard, though the heat was constant. It was the weight of everything else, of dust in the nostrils, of smoke from half-dead fires, of silence that thickened with waiting. The lungs had to filter more than oxygen. They had to sift through memory, through fear, through the invisible particles of decay that hung in the camp like forgotten prayers. Every inhale was a negotiation. How much can I take in without hurting? How long can I hold it before the ache becomes sharp? Even sleep offered no release. Dreams came with their own rhythms, but the body did not forget. It breathed with caution even then, the chest rising slowly, the mouth closed, as if hoarding the air from the night itself. And in the morning, when the sun returned and the heat rose again, they rose with it, already breathless. The children learned early: no running, no shouting, no crying unless absolutely necessary. Their games, when they happened at all, were quiet and still. A hand passed a stone. A whisper passed a rule. They watched the adults and copied the way their chests moved, the way their shoulders stayed still. Even laughter was soft now, held behind teeth, pushed through the nose like smoke. A deep laugh could steal too much breath. A shout could bring coughing that wouldn't stop. So the sounds became internal. Hums instead of songs. Murmurs instead of speech. Sighs, when they came, were slow and silent. Even grief was measured, because sobbing took too much air, and air, like everything else, was limited. The body could go longer without food, shorter without water, but breath was immediate. It was now, and if it ran out, there was no storing it for later. And still, they kept breathing. Not because it was easy, but because it was the only motion that had not yet been taken from them. Inhale, pause, exhale, count to 5. Do it again. Each breath became a rhythm, a prayer, a ritual. Some sat with their eyes closed for hours, not sleeping, just breathing, as if each inhale might remind the body that it still existed, as if the slow pull of air might hold them together a little longer. The breath did not soothe, it did not restore, it simply sustained. Like a string pulled taut between two empty spaces, it kept them upright, kept them conscious, kept them able to face the next hour. And in that breath, as thin and dry as it was, lived a kind of strength, quiet, unseen, but relentless. The strength of not wasting, the strength of still choosing to breathe, even when everything else had already been taken. The ground beneath them did not forgive. It baked under the sun until it hardened into something sharper than stone, scattered with splinters of dried root, the bones of old animals, and the fragments of tools left behind in exhaustion. Every step was an argument between the flesh and the earth. The soles of their feet, once calloused and thick from seasons of movement, had begun to split. The skin tore in narrow lines, peeled in strips, bled into the dust until even blood stopped flowing. When they stepped, it wasn't with stride, it was with strategy. Each movement calculated, each toe placed not where it was easiest, but where it might hurt least, but still they walked. Even with wounds open to the sun, even with skin falling away like bark from a dying tree. They walked because the body demanded it, because stillness was not an option, because the world was not coming closer. They had to go to it. The mornings were worst. After sleep, such as it was, the feet had stiffened. The raw skin dried, cracked anew with the first pressure. Standing up became a kind of ritual. One hand on the knee, one breath held in the throat. A moment of bracing before weight was placed. But no one groaned. Groaning took energy, and pain, like thirst, had become background noise. Some wrapped cloth around their feet, but cloth wore through before midday. Others bound bark or strips of hide beneath the heel, but they shifted with every step, rubbed sores into new places. The dust offered no comfort. It worked into the flesh like sandpaper, darkening every wound, thickening every blister. But they walked. They had to. For water, for roots, for the chance of a lizard sunbathing too long on a stone, for the idea that something might still exist beyond the bend of the dead riverbed. Sometimes they limped, sometimes they dragged one foot behind the other, sometimes they moved like ghosts, bodies that had forgotten how to glide. But motion continued. The ones who walked farthest were often the quietest. They didn't speak of the ache or the blood or the way the bones in their feet had begun to feel like tools grinding against each other. They simply returned, faces drawn, eyes filmy with fatigue, feet covered in grime and redness. And if they had something, water, meat, bark, they were received with quiet hands. If they returned empty, they were not blamed. The walk itself had become a form of contribution. Each step was labor. Each return, no matter how empty, was a testament. The earth had not claimed them yet. That was enough. And then they did it again. The next day, the next hour, whenever it was needed. Because water did not come to the camp. Because food no longer waited nearby. Because the horizon had not moved. And yet everything they needed lived beyond it. So they walked on feet that cracked, bled, hardened, split again. And in doing so, they became something more than bodies. They became lines in the dust, paths between need and possibility. Every wound was a story, every step a refusal to surrender. The ground did not soften, and neither did they. And though each return grew slower, though each breath before movement grew longer, they always rose, always stepped, always walked. Because walking was more than function. It was the final proof that something inside them still believed the world might change. Or at the very least, that they would reach the next tree before the body gave up. Either way, the feet moved, even as they crumbled. They still looked up, though not for the reasons they once did. The movement of the eyes toward the sky had become a reflex, a remnant of older days when the heavens still gave. They lifted their heads, not with longing, but with memory, of a time when clouds meant change, when birds overhead meant water nearby, when a shift in light could stir something like joy. Now the sky was just a ceiling, pale, blank, unbroken, a lid on a world that had long stopped opening, but the habit remained. After digging, after walking, after waking, their eyes drifted upward as if pulled by something older than thought. They didn't expect to see rain. They didn't expect to see anything. It was not hope that raised their gaze. It was the echo of hope, worn thin and hollow, still tethered to the body like breath. The sky gave them nothing. No wind, no shadow, no movement. Just its endless dome, white by day and black by night, offering only glare or indifference. In that emptiness, something inside them adjusted. They no longer searched it for answers. They no longer asked. They only stared, briefly, mechanically, then lowered their eyes again to the dust, the cracks, the task at hand. Even when thunder spoke, even when the air thickened for a moment with the illusion of change, their eyes did not widen. They had seen too many lies. The clouds, when they came like ghosts. No weight, no water, just shapes. The sun passed behind them for a moment, and then returned, harder than before. So they stopped reading the sky like scripture. It had become a blank page, and still, they looked. Because not looking made the silence louder. Children looked too, but their glances were quicker, more uncertain. They didn't remember rain. Not truly. Their looking was mimicry. The way they copied the way their parents walked, sat, breathed, eyes up, then down. Nothing there. Move on. A few still asked, in soft voices, if the clouds meant anything. The answers came slow, or didn't come at all, because what could be said that hadn't already been swallowed by silence? The adults no longer pointed to shapes in the sky, no longer told stories of animals hidden in the stars, of spirits who rode on clouds. Those stories had dried out with the rivers. Now, when they looked up, it was as animals might, instinctively, cautiously, without belief. The sky was no longer a god. It was just another surface, vast, unchanging, and beyond reach. And yet the act of looking persisted. Quiet, repeated, ordinary. A movement so small it was barely seen, yet so deeply ingrained it could not be unlearned. They looked up while drinking, if there was water. They looked up while sharpening tools, or resting, or blinking dust from their eyes. And in that motion, brief as it was, there was still something almost sacred. Not hope. Hope had edges. Hope waited for return. This was something softer, something emptier. Not a prayer, not a question, just a glance into the blank, like checking a closed door you know will not open. And though they never said it, never marked it with words, they all knew. One day, maybe, the sky might break its silence. But until then, they would keep looking, not because they believed, but because they once did. And that, in its own quiet way, was enough. It wasn't silent. That was the first mistake, to think the drought was quiet, that the absence of water meant an absence of sound. But it was full of sound. Thin, dry, persistent. It was in the way the ground split open with a slow groan, in the way dust shifted underfoot like crushed bones. Every step came with a crunch, every movement a whisper of friction, skin against cloth, foot against stone, breath against throat. At night, the quiet deepened but never vanished. You could hear the heat still radiating from the earth, the faint creak of bark shrinking, the soft collapse of soil withdrawing from root. The people no longer noticed these sounds as separate things. They formed a single texture, a dry, brittle music that wrapped itself around the camp and never left. Drought had a voice, and it spoke constantly, without pause, without mercy. Even the bodies made noise. Skin cracked like old leaves. Elbows scraped against ribs with the sound of worn leather. Fingernails, dulled from digging, clicked faintly when hands rested in the lap. Mouths opened but rarely closed fully, too dry to seal. When someone coughed, the sound cut through the air like flint. Short, sharp, final. The breath itself was noise, not soft and flowing, but broken into small, cautious pulls. Children's footsteps no longer pattered. They dragged. The sound of dragging became a measure of fatigue, a metronome for days that no longer changed. When sleep came, it was shallow and restless, and the night filled with the rustle of bodies trying to find a cool place, a softer place, a place that didn't sound like dying grass, but no such place remained. Even dreams, if they arrived, did so with their own rustle. Phantoms of water moving through a throat that knew it wasn't real. Outside the camp, the sounds sharpened. Wind picked up dust and threw it against the sides of trees, where it scraped like sandpaper. Birds no longer called, but their wings could still be heard, thin and frantic as they searched for something that wasn't there. Insects, once everywhere, now came in waves of clicking and silence, as if debating whether to continue. The bones of animals shifted in the sun, sometimes cracking under their own weight, sometimes moved by scavengers too weak to drag them far. And always, the ground made noise, not a roar, not a cry, but a tension, a kind of pressure. It clicked and sighed beneath the surface, like something holding back a breath for too long. And the people heard it, even if they didn't speak of it. They felt it in their feet, in their teeth, in the hollow behind their ribs. But the worst sound was the one that wasn't there. the one they all remembered but never spoke aloud. The sound of water, of it moving, splashing, falling, dripping, of it being poured, stirred, touched. The sound of it resting in a bowl, of it cooling the hands. That sound had become myth. Its absence was a scream that echoed through everything else. Every crack of earth, every cough, every shift of ash reminded them of what was no longer here. Drought did not need to shout. It spoke constantly, in 1,000 small ways, until the ears adjusted and the silence was redefined. Until what was missing became part of the music. And so they listened, not because they wanted to, but because there was nothing else. No comfort, no rain. Only the brittle chorus of a land forgetting how to live. And the people, brittle too, became part of its song. It happened in a way that made no sense at first. Just a small shift, barely enough to notice. A stone that once lay flat now leaned to the side. Dust that had been still for days lifted in the air without wind. Someone dropped a gourd, not from weakness, but from surprise. The earth had moved, not rolled like thunder, not cracked like lightning, but trembled, low, strange, and deep. It passed through the soles of the feet like a warning, through the knees like a question. The people froze. Was it real? Or was the exhaustion finally blurring the line between what the body felt and what the world did? They looked at one another, silently searching for confirmation. Had they all felt it? Or was it just one heart pounding too loud, one breath drawn too quickly? But then it came again, faint, slow, steady. The ground was moving. Something below was shifting. For a moment, no one spoke. Then someone crouched, placed their palm against the dust. It vibrated. Not violently, not rhythmically, but with a weight like something turning beneath. Not a beast, not a storm, but the earth itself realigning in its silence. Some thought it was a tremor, the kind that once came with rains, when distant mountains pulled at the ground. Others thought it was hunger, fatigue so severe that even the bones mistook stillness for motion. The line between internal collapse and external change had grown too thin to trust. Knees buckled not from fear, but from doubt. Was the land waking up, or was the body finally failing? The difference no longer mattered. All they knew was that the stillness had broken, and nothing ever broke without cost. Children pressed themselves to the ground, whispering that they could hear it, like a breath, like an animal sleeping below the surface. One woman wept, not from fear, but from memory. She said the last time the earth moved like this, the rain had followed. She said it without hope, only as fact, like someone remembering a name they had long stopped saying aloud. But the old ones shook their heads. This wasn't that. This was something else, something slower, something uncertain. They warned not to trust it. The earth could tease like the sky did. It could mimic change without offering it. Still, they all stayed low, listening. The sound was barely there, but once heard, it couldn't be forgotten. A pulse from beneath. A signal, or maybe just the final groan of something giving way. And then, just as slowly as it had come, the movement faded, the ground settled, the dust stilled. But the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of drought, but the silence of after shift, after question, after something unseen had passed through and left nothing but tremble in its wake. The people rose slowly, unsure whether to speak of it, whether naming it would make it vanish or make it real. No decision was made. They simply resumed their quiet routines, glancing at the ground more often, walking with lighter steps, Something had moved. Whether it had been the earth or themselves or the limit of their endurance didn't matter. It had moved. And now they waited to see what would come next, if anything would come at all. It came softly, like a memory returning from a place no longer real. Not in the wind, there was no wind, but in the stillness, in the air itself. A shift, a hint, something that didn't belong. The people noticed it at different times. One turned their head without knowing why. Another paused mid-step, eyes narrowing, nostrils flaring, and then it hit them. Subtle at first, then unmistakable. Wetness, not the feel of it, but the scent. A raw, rich smell that cut through the dust and smoke like a blade. It smelled of damp bark and softened soil, of roots reawakening, of the world beneath the surface exhaling for the first time in too long. It hit deeper than hunger, faster than fear. Their bodies remembered it before their minds did. The smell of rain, not clouds or wind, but earth about to receive water. They didn't say anything. No one dared to speak the word. They only stood still and breathed, long and careful, as if pulling the scent too quickly might break it. Eyes closed, mouths opened slightly. They wanted to taste it, not just smell it. It coated the inside of their heads, a thickness, a weight, a kind of sweetness that had nothing to do with sugar. Someone dropped their tool without noticing. A child began to cry, not loud, but quietly, as if overwhelmed. The air pressed differently against the skin now. Still dry, still hot, but thinner, more open. It no longer clung. It moved. Even the insects reacted, rising, shifting, humming in patterns that had been lost for weeks. The smell drew them all toward the horizon without command, without plan. Their legs moved of their own accord. Their bodies had remembered something they'd been trying not to forget. Before they saw anything, they found themselves walking toward it, into it, with a kind of hunger that had no shape. Eyes scanned the land, still cracked and colorless, but the scent grew stronger with every step. Somewhere, something had changed. Somewhere, water had touched ground. They didn't know if it was close or far, if it was a storm or a spill or a miracle. They didn't care. The smell had entered them. It lived behind the ribs now, curled like a seed. It made them walk faster. The tiredness in their limbs was still there, but it no longer led them. The scent did. One foot, then another. Some limped, some wept openly now. Not from joy, not yet, but from the sudden memory of softness, of moisture, of life that didn't require effort. And then finally, someone pointed. Not up, not down, but forward. A shimmer, low to the ground. Not light, not color. Just a shift. A shape against the sky that hadn't been there before. Still too far to name, but the smell told them it was real. The earth ahead had been touched. It had drunk, and now it spoke through scent. That moment, that breath was more powerful than food, more powerful than any promise. It was proof. The world had not ended. Not yet. Something still moved. Something still gave. They walked without talking, without planning. Their faces wet not from rain, but from something close. Closer than it had been in many days. The smell filled them, lifted them, rewrote them. And as they stepped forward, they were no longer only waiting. They were returning to something they thought they'd lost forever. Not rain, not yet, but the beginning of it, the truth of it, alive in the air. It didn't begin with a drop. There was no gentle start, no warning drizzle. The sky didn't soften, it split. A A soundless second of stillness cracked open, and then it fell. All of it, all at once. Rain came not like a whisper, but like a collapse, as if the weight of 1,000 held-back storms had broken free in a single breath. It struck the ground with a violence that stole the breath from their chests. It hammered the dust into mud, flattened leaves where leaves had barely survived, filled the cracks in the earth faster than they could drink. For a moment, no one moved. The impact was too loud, too sudden, too impossible. It wasn't the idea of rain. They had forgotten what that meant. It was the reality of it. Cold, heavy, alive. It hit skin like stones, like fists, like salvation wearing the face of pain. Bodies instinctively ducked, hands lifted not in joy but in reflex, as if from attack. The skin, long cracked and dry, screamed under the sudden touch of cold water. Wounds stung, eyes flooded, not with tears, but with runoff. Mouths opened, not for speech, but for catching. They drank before they understood they were doing it, before the brain could name it. And when the first shock passed, when the cold settled into muscles that hadn't known softness in weeks, they stood, heads tilted back, arms wide. The weight of it soaked through everything. Cloth, dust, hair, memory. The sound was deafening. It drowned out the old silence, replaced it with something deeper, heavier, more real than anything they had held on to. They didn't dance. They didn't cheer. They endured it like you endure a miracle. With awe, with trembling, with reverence. Because when the sky breaks, it doesn't ask if you're ready. The ground, overwhelmed, became something else entirely. Where there had been cracks, there was now foam and slurry. Where there had been hardness, there was shifting, bubbling, sudden softness. The camp turned to liquid in minutes. Mats floated. Fires died. Tools disappeared beneath pooling water. Children fell and laughed through mouthfuls of mud, not because it was fun, but because their bodies could no longer contain the shock. Elders sat still, eyes closed, faces lifted like stone statues weathering a storm they never thought would return. Some people wept openly, not from joy, not fully, but from release, from the undoing of waiting, from the shattering of the long, quiet suffering that had calcified in their bones. Rain fell down their spines, into their wounds, into their open palms, and they let it. It hurt. It healed. It flooded every part of them. There were no words, only the rhythm of it, the drumbeat of water on earth, on skin, on bark, on bone. It washed the blood from their heels, the salt from their skin, the dust from their eyes. It blurred the world. It made them new. For that hour, or minute, or lifetime, no one counted. Time became water. Thought became water. Everything became water. And though they knew the rain would not stay, that it would pass like all things pass, they did not chase it. They did not bottle it or beg it to remain. They simply stood inside it, and in that moment, they were not waiting anymore. They were not surviving. They were alive. Alive in a world that could still break open and give. Alive under a sky that, at last, had remembered how to weep. In the hours after the rain, the world became unrecognizable. The edges of things softened. The hard lines of the cracked earth were gone, blurred into smooth, thick pools of clay. The dust that had lived in the air, on skin, in mouths, gone, replaced by the heavy, sweet scent of wet soil. And where the bones had been, white, clean, untouched for weeks, there was only mud now. The ribs of antelope, the skulls of small scavengers, even the brittle leg of something long dead, all vanished beneath the weight of water and time. not buried, dissolved, absorbed. The drought had kept death visible, arranged in silent displays across the landscape. But the rain, sudden and total, had undone the display. Now death sank into the ground, losing its shape, its sharpness, its power. What had once been a warning was now just earth again. People walked through it with hesitation, their feet unsure of this new softness. Where once the ground cut and cracked, it now gave way. It sucked at their heels, held their steps for a moment longer than expected, and painted their legs with streaks of gray and red and brown. Some laughed at the strangeness. Others looked down and didn't know how to feel. A place that had meant death, where they had passed carcasses, where they had whispered stories, where they had dug shallow graves, was now a shifting field of mud. There were no markers anymore. The earth had reclaimed everything. Some felt relief, as if the past had been erased. Others felt unease, as if forgetting had come too easily. But no one spoke aloud of the bones. They all knew what had been there. The mud was not just water and earth, it held memory. Children splashed through it, reckless and wide-eyed, their knees stained, their hands slick. They didn't know where the bones had been. They didn't need to. For them, this was new earth, soft, forgiving, alive. They rolled in it, built shapes from it, smeared it across their arms and faces like paint. The adults let them, not because they had forgotten, but because the children had not lived through enough to be haunted. And for a moment, watching them, the camp allowed itself something close to peace. Not celebration, but peace. Because death, so constant, so visible, had been swallowed, not defeated, but hidden. That was enough. For now, no skull stared from the ground. No ribs curled like questions into the sun. The earth had taken them back, and the people, covered in mud, moved forward through a world without bones. By evening, the land was quiet again, but not the same quiet. It was heavy now, humming beneath the surface. The water still pooled in places. The mud still clung. And where there had been death, there was now nothing to see. No grave markers, no skeletons, no shrines. The rain had been both mercy and erasure. It had fed the roots and stolen the proof. But the people did not mourn this. They had mourned long enough. Now they simply remembered. Silently. With each step through the softened ground, they remembered. And the land, for the first time in a long while, did not resist. It held them, not with sharpness or heat, but with weight, with depth, with the echo of what had passed. The bones were gone, the mud remained. And in that mud, something like life stirred again. By morning, the rain was gone. It didn't fade or taper. It simply ended, as if cut off mid-sentence. What it left behind was not calm, not joy, but cold. A deep, creeping damp that settled into everything. Cloth, skin, bone. The fire pits were soaked. The mats held water like sponges. Even the tools felt heavy, their wooden handles swollen, their stones darkened. The air was still, but no longer hot. The warmth that had once pressed down like a weight had vanished, leaving behind a chill that clung to wet backs and bare feet. The ground squelched with every step, unfamiliar and unstable. Nothing cracked now. Everything yielded, everything stuck. And the people who had waited so long for rain now found themselves waiting again, for sun, for heat, for something to lift the water back into the sky. The blessing had become burden. Their bodies, once used to dryness and burn, now shivered in the damp. The skin, softened by rain, tore easily. Cuts reopened, rashes bloomed, Feet that had bled in dust now sank into mud that chilled them to the bone. Children, once delighted by the downpour, now sat quiet and cold, wrapped in dripping cloth. They watched the sky, expecting it to open again, but it didn't. It held its breath, gray and unmoving. No light broke through, only a dim haze that offered no warmth. The people tried to dry their things, by fire, by wringing, by body heat, but nothing dried. The damp lived in everything now, even in the voice. Speech became slower, hoarser, swallowed by shivers. And the silence that followed was not the silence of heat or thirst. It was the silence of too much, of saturation, of new discomforts forming in the absence of old ones. They didn't regret the rain, not fully. It had saved them in ways too deep to name. It had given back water to the roots, loosened the air, softened the earth. But it had also taken control. It had made the ground its own. It had turned the familiar world into something foreign, slippery, unstable, hidden under a layer of moving soil. The same places they had walked for weeks were now uncertain. The paths blurred, landmarks vanished underwater. The riverbeds, once dry and easy to cross, now flowed again, but too fast, too wild, too muddy to drink from. And so the people waited, again. This time not for something to come, but for something to leave, for the ground to harden, for the sun to burn off the weight of the storm, for balance. The rain had not ended the waiting. It had only changed its shape. And so they stood in the gray morning light, shoulders hunched, arms crossed against the cold, eyes scanning the sky for brightness. They didn't ask aloud. They didn't plead. They had learned. The sky answered only when it wanted and never twice the same way. Still, their bodies turned eastward. Still, their hands reached toward their fires, coaxing what little heat remained. Still, they watched the clouds move like slow animals across the dome above them, unsure if they were leaving or simply resting. There was no celebration, no relief, only another kind of endurance. The sun would come eventually. It always did. But now they understood. Even blessings carried weight. Even salvation could sting. And waiting was not a moment that ended. It was a rhythm, a cycle, a breath held between trials. And now, with water in their footprints and cold on their skin, they waited again. For warmth, for dryness, for the return of the sky they had once cursed and now quietly missed. Close your eyes now. Let the weight of the sky fade, the taste of dust drift away, the rhythm of footsteps dissolve into stillness. The drought has passed, the rain has spoken, and the waiting begins again, but not for you, not tonight. Let your breath slow, your body soften, your thoughts sink into the deep, warm earth. Sleep is here, quiet and steady, like the sound of distant rain on forgotten ground. Let it carry you, let it hold you, until the next story finds you.